Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. I want to take a moment to personally thank each and every one who has subscribed to the channel. I am very grateful and humbled by your support and for helping this channel get closer to reaching 1,000 subscribers. Thank you very much. It's time, once again, for another depressing dose of dismal Disney. Superhero movies are incredibly commonplace nowadays, though that wasn't always the case. One of the very first superhero movies to be produced was the hour-long 1951 film Superman and the Mole Men, which starred George Reeves as Superman and was thus a DC Comics-based superhero film and was intended for a children's audience. 15 years would elapse before the next superhero film would be produced, the 1966 Batman film starring Adam West as Batman and Burt Ward as his sidekick Robin, making it the second DC Comics-based film, and like its predecessor, it was intended for children. It's also quite comical. Another 12 years would pass before the release of the next superhero film, the 1978 Superman, starring Christopher Reeve as Superman, who's also known as Clark Kent, and Kal-El. It also starred Margot Kidder as his love interest Lois Lane, who is also his fellow reporter at the fictional newspaper The Daily Planet. Unlike its two predecessors from the previous 2 decades, this film was intended for a more adult audience, making it, in my own opinion, the first modern-day superhero film. It was also widely acclaimed, winning a Special Achievement Oscar at the 1979 Academy Awards, and it was also nominated for 3 other Oscars. It was the beginning of a series of sequels, as well as a more adult version of Batman that would emerge years later in 1989, starring Michael Keaton as the title character. That film won an Oscar for Best Art Direction and Set Decoration. So between 1978 and 1997, there were a total of 12 DC Comics-based superhero films released featuring the characters Superman, Batman, Supergirl, Swamp Thing, and Steel. But not all of those films were good. In fact, 2 of those films are counted among my unwatchable films that I talked about in my video entitled 10 More Unwatchable Films that I released on April 26, 2022. And those 2 films are 1987's Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, which was incredibly bad, and 1997's Batman and Robin, which was so bad that it effectively halted the production of any more DC Comics-based films for 7 years. In other words, it was essentially a franchise killer. Marvel Comics' first ever entry at the box office was the utterly deplorable and universally despised 1986 film Howard the Duck. So the next Marvel Comics-based film didn't premiere until 12 years later with the release of the first Blade movie in 1998 starring Wesley Snipes as the title character. That film did quite well and led to 2 sequels. The next Marvel superhero offering was in 2000 with the release of the first X-Men movie, and it also did very well in theaters and was followed by a number of sequels. So between 1978 and the year 2000, there were a total of 15 superhero movies, which includes Howard the Duck, which averages out to roughly 2 movies every 3 years. No DC or Marvel Comics-based superhero movies were released in the year 2001, and it is in fact also the most recent year in which there were no superhero films released. 2001 marks a transition point because everything changed beginning in 2002. 2 superhero movies were released in 2002, and in fact, there have always been at least 2 superhero movies released every year since then. So between 2002 and the time that I'm recording this video on February 18th, 2023, there have been 85 superhero movies released that are based on either DC or Marvel Comics. As illustrated in this chart, over the period of 22 years that ran from 1978 to 2000, we went from an average of around 2 superhero movies being released every 3 years to a period of 21 years beginning in the year 2002, with an average of 4 superhero movies being released each year. So from before 2001 to after 2001, the total number of superhero films being released each year increased by a factor of 6. Does that sound like oversaturation to you? If we examine the 85 superhero films released since 2002, we find that 31 are MCU movies, 32 are non-MCU Marvel movies, and the remaining 22 are DC Comics-based movies. Those 31 MCU movies represent 36.5% of the 85 superhero movies released since 2002, even though they didn't actually begin to be released until 2008. So if we narrow the range down a bit, there were 17 superhero films released between 2002 and 2007, which means that there were 68 superhero movies released between 2008 and the time that I am recording this video in February 2023. This means that since 2008, nearly 46% of all superhero films released are MCU films. The remaining 54% are nearly evenly split between non-MCU Marvel-based superhero movies and DC Comics-based superhero movies. But if we look at it from the perspective of just the Marvel Comics-based films released since 2008, which is 74% of all the superhero films released since then, 2/3 of those Marvel Comics-based films are in fact MCU films. So Disney and Marvel Studios have dominated the superhero film market since its inception in 2008, and for good reason. For the most part, they have been extremely profitable for Disney and Marvel Studios. And the most profitable period for the MCU films began in 2012 with the release of The Avengers, which marked the tail end of the MCU's so-called Phase 1. The high profitability continued in an unbroken line of 20 films through to the release of the 2019 film Spider-Man: Far From Home, which was the final film of the MCU's Phase 3. These 20 films that include all of the films released during Phases 2 and 3 and the tail end of Phase 1 was the MCU's financial heyday, representing an approximate cumulative profit of over $10.9 billion. In other words, those 20 films had an average profit of roughly $545 million per film, but that came to a swift end with the beginning of MCU's Phase 4, that is more commonly known as the M-Shu-U, due to its emphasis on strong female characters dominating most of its films. The first of the M-Shu-U films was Black Widow, which flopped in theaters, losing around $120 million. Shang-Chi managed to earn around $57 million, which was only around a tenth of what each of the heyday films were earning on average. Then the Eternals film also flopped, losing around $98 million. But the next two M-Shu-U films, Spider-Man: No Way Home and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, are the two oddballs in that they both earned very high profits like the films that had been released during the MCU's heyday because they were more closely related to the Phase 3 films. But the final two M-Shu-U films, Thor: Love and Thunder and Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, saw profitabilities that were around $120 million and $110 million. So both of these films were only earning around 20% of what an average MCU heyday film was earning at around $545 million per film. In fact, if you ignore the two most profitable M-Shu-U films, the average profitability for the remaining 5 female-dominated M-Shu-U movies was a measly $13 million, which is only around 2.4% of the average profitability of MCU's heyday films. It's no wonder that after years of Marvel movies and shows inundating screens big and small, Disney is finally putting the brakes on the output of some of its biggest franchises and brands following Bob Iger's February 8th comments that the company needs to be better at curating franchise content that's extraordinarily expensive. Iger added, "We want the quality on the screen, but we have to look at what they cost us." The M-Shu-U was a huge mistake for Disney's profitability, and it will be interesting to see how the Phase 5 movies perform, starting with the release of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania that opened in theaters yesterday. Currently, I personally don't believe that oversaturation is the reason that the Phase 4 M-Shu-U films broke the MCU's 20-film streak of high profitability. The large number of comic book-based superhero movies that are released each year can still draw large enough audiences provided their content is what audiences actually want to pay to see. Thus, It's far more likely that the 5 M-Shu-U films that either underperformed or flopped altogether did so because audiences simply weren't sufficiently interested in their narratives, stories, or characters. Until Disney and Marvel Studios start producing films that audiences actually want to pay to see, they're going to lose money and Disney's shareholders won't be happy. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to see more of our videos in the future and help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.